Hi all. Today I'm talking about contractarianism. Contractarianism is the aspect of social contract theory concerned primarily with ethics and morality. And in today's lecture I want to do a few things. First, I want to introduce Thomas Hobbes. He's thought to be the father of social contract theory and contractarianism. And second, I want to talk about some of his concerns that led him to developing his theory. So we'll follow his line into contractarianism. But then we're going to take a more modern approach to contractarianism. We're going to look at some findings in game theory, or some developments in game theory, specifically prisoners' dilemmas. That's sort of another avenue into contractarianism. And finally, what I'd like to do in this lecture is spell out the basic principle of contractarianism. So, with those as our goals, let's begin. So, Thomas Hobbes is the author of a work called Leviathan, in which he lays out social contract theory. A British man who lived from 1588 to 1679. And he developed social contract theory in that work, and social contract theory in a nutshell is the view that a person's moral and or political obligations are dependent upon a contract or agreement among them to form the society in which they live. And the idea is that the people agree to this social contract because it's for everyone's benefit. So Hobbes developed his moral system in an interesting way. He started with this fundamental fact about human beings, that human beings are generally selfish. So to put a finer point on this, we're self-interested. So we're not only concerned with our own well-being, but we're primarily concerned with our own well-being. And a way you can see this is if there were no laws to restrain us. You can think of pre-civilized man. Pre-civilized man will do what they need to do to survive. So if their lives are threatened, they'll do whatever is necessary to survive. And it's easy to see why we would be primarily concerned with our own well-being, because we feel our own effects on our own well-being. So we feel our own pain and pleasure. We don't directly, at least, feel other people's pain and pleasure. So what Hobbes tried to do, and what contractarians have tried to do after Hobbes, is develop a theory of morality from this this quality of human beings that were generally self-interested, more interested in our own well-being than others. And that's, as you might already see, is a difficult task. So it's pretty impressive that they're able to do this, or we'll see if they're able to do this, right? Now, Hobbes himself was an open supporter of a sovereign power, the monarch in England at his time, and thought that that was the best form of government. We don't need to follow him in that belief. For now, we'll skip into the beginning of his theory and see how he gets to the conclusions he does. So Hobbes starts with this idea of the state of nature, and to start getting ourselves in this mindset of what the state of nature is, we can think of what we might imagine pre-civilized man, pre-civilized humans, what sort of state they would be living in. So what sort of conditions they would be living in, what their lives would be like. So the state of nature has four distinguishing features, according to Hobbes. The first is what he calls equality of need. So, while there can be some slight variation from person to person in terms of what they need, all human beings need food, shelter, and clothing. So, in that way, we're generally equal in our needs. Now, in our wants, we might be very different, but in terms of our need, and especially pre-civilized man, we need food, shelter, and clothing. And in roughly the same amount, right? You need enough clothing to keep clothes on you. You need enough food from day to day, and you need not even stable shelter, but you need some shelter just about every day. And the state of nature is marked also by scarcity. So what we might call moderate scarcity. And that's just to say that everything that humans need in a state of nature is not readily available. People have to work for it. So food isn't just popping up all around humans in the state of nature. It's something that they need to work for, whether they're hunting or gathering or starting to organize and to farm. Getting food takes work. Creating shelter and maintaining shelter takes work. Creating clothing takes work. And then there's this other feature, the essential equality of human power. Now, when we come to this, we might think, well, some people are smarter, some people are stronger. What can Hobbes possibly mean by the essential equality of human power? And he means just this. Even the smartest, strongest person can be taken down by 2 or at most 3 other people. And by taken down, I mean killed, right? So nobody is above being killed by other people. So while there may be differences in power levels, in pre-civilized man, those differences in power are lesser than they are in civilized man. And because everybody can be killed by somebody else, there's this essential equality of human power. And finally, the final fact the final distinguishing feature of the state of nature is what Hobbes calls limited altruism. And that just means that we can't solely rely, human beings in the state of nature can't solely rely on the generosity of others to get all of the things that they need. They need to work themselves and get some of these resources that are scarce. Now, these 4 distinguishing qualities of the state of nature leads to what Hobbes calls war of all against all. So people want to acquire what they need to survive, and they're primarily self-interested, so concerned more with their own survival than other people's survival. And they're able to kill each other to do this, and we are limited altruistically, so we aren't just living in some sort of utopia. The state of nature, as Hobbes conceived it, is nasty, brutish, and short. It's something that people would want to escape if they were in it. So, what do we need to escape the state of nature? We'll get to that. But before we get to that, I want to talk about another way in, another inroad into contractarianism, and that's a thought experiment called the prisoner's dilemma. So, in a prisoner's dilemma, in the traditional way of conceiving the prisoner's dilemma, 2 people are brought in for a crime, but there's not enough evidence to convict either of them fully. So both detainees are offered the same deal. If they testify against the other person, then they will go free, or something close to that, depending on what the other person does. So what is the problem with what problem arises out of a circumstance like this? So look at the matrix down here in the bottom right. Let's say the 2 prisoners are Alice and Bob. So Alice is prisoner A, Bob is prisoner B. They're the people who have been arrested for this crime. They're both told that if they testify against the other person, then they'll go free, but they're told in a little more detail exactly what will happen. So Alice is told if Bob, Alice is told that Bob is also being given the same deal, that if if Bob testifies against her, then he'll go free. So Alice is told more specifically that if Bob does not testify against her, so Bob remains silent, then if she also remains silent, that they'll both do a year's time. They'll both spend a year in prison. If Bob remains silent and she testifies against him, then she'll go scot-free. He'll get 10 years. She's further told that if Bob testifies against her and she remains silent, then she'll get 10 years while Bob will go scot-free. And if they both betray each other, if they both testify against the other person, then they'll both get 5 years. So one thing to note here, look at all the quadrants of this chart. In the bottom left, the top right, and the bottom right, the amount of time, the amount of combined time that the prisoners do is 10 years. In the top left, the combined time is 2 years. So if we were concerned with maximizing utility, maximizing well-being, the best thing to happen would be neither of them testifies against each other and they both get a year's time, because then the total amount of time is only 2 years. But here's why this scenario presents a problem for people that are basically self-interested, that are primarily self-interested. For Alice, if Bob remains silent, the best thing for her to do, if she's concerned primarily with her own well-being, imagine she's concerned exclusively with her own well-being. The best thing for her to do, if she knew that Bob were to remain silent, would be to testify against him. Because in that case where he remains silent, if she remains silent, then she gets a year. If she testifies, she goes free. Better to go free than to do a year in prison. And the same can be said if she knew that Bob was going to testify against her. The best thing that she could do is testify against him. Because if he testifies against her and she remains silent, then she's going to do 10 years in jail. If he testifies against her, and the best thing to do is for her to testify against him, because she would get 5 years instead of 10 years. So the best thing for her to do, regardless of what Bob does, if she's concerned with her own well-being primarily, the best thing Alice can do is testify against him. Because whether he remains silent or not, she gets the best thing for her in both of those circumstances. And then the same thing can be said for Bob. If Alice remains silent, the best thing for him to do is testify against her. Better to go scot-free than get 1 year. And if Alice testifies against him, then the best thing for him to do is testify against her, because then he'll get 5 years instead of 10 years, and better to get 5 years instead of 10 years. So you see the box that's circled here. If both Alice and Bob are rationally self-interested, concerned primarily with their own well-being, then they'll both end up testifying against the other person. They'll both end up getting 5 years of jail time. So this is a problem because utility will not be maximized. If people are only rationally looking out for their own self-interest, then in many circumstances, utility will not be maximized. And this prisoner's dilemma is not just a fun thought experiment to get us to think about social contract theory. We find ourselves in situations like this frequently. So think of an example that's been in the headlines lately. I'm making this video in November of 2020. There's been a lot of talk about our obligation to pay taxes. So think about paying taxes and think about what circumstance regarding taxes would be best for you. The best situation, if you are only concerned with your own self-interest, would be everybody else chips in and you don't chip in. You just get to what's called free ride on everybody else. So everybody else chips in. We get wonderful things like nice roads, protection from the police department. We get protection from fires with the fire department. We get public libraries, public parks. You get all of these great things, and you don't have to do anything to bring those about. Everybody else does, and you get to free ride. If you're concerned only with your self-interest, that's the best circumstance for you. And if you were Alice, then that would be the bottom left box here. The second best circumstance would be everybody pitches in. So you pay taxes, but at the same time everybody else pays taxes. That if you're Alice or if you're Bob, that's actually the top left box here, with most people only getting 2 years' time. So with regard to taxes, everybody pays taxes. You also pay taxes. So you get to enjoy things like public parks, like libraries, like protection from the protection the government offers in terms of police departments and fire departments. Not a bad deal, right? The next best, so a bad situation, but not quite the worst, is if nobody pitched in. So nobody's pitching in, nobody's paying taxes. We don't have things like police departments, fire departments, and public roads, or if we have those things, they're private and it takes a toll, and libertarians might think otherwise, but this would, as like the best thing, the way that I think this would go, it would be a bad situation. And in our prisoner's dilemma, that would correspond to the box in the bottom right. Now, the very worst situation is you're paying taxes, you're doing your duty, but other people are shirking their responsibility. They're not paying their taxes. That's the worst situation. So while you may get things like police departments, fire departments, roads, libraries, public parks, they're not going to be very good because you're the one chipping in, and nobody else, or very few other people are living up to their obligation. Now, what headline am I thinking about? I'm thinking about the headline that came out recently that Donald Trump paid something like hundreds in taxes over the course of 1 or 2 years, I think 2016 and 2017. And that seems obscene because his public image, at least, is that he's a very wealthy person. He certainly is associated with businesses that have a lot in profits. You can imagine him telling his investors that they're making tons in profits and then going, oh, do I want to pay taxes? I don't want to pay taxes. Paying somebody to come up with creative ways not to do his fair share, paying for the things, the public goods that we all like to enjoy. So he's free riding here. And why do people get so upset about that? Because then that puts them in the situation in the prisoner's dilemma where they're doing 10 years while other people are going scot-free. Other people are free riding, taking advantage of the people who are living up to their obligations, paying their fair share. All right, so what do we need to escape the state of nature, if you're thinking about this in Hobbesian terms, or the prisoner's dilemma, if you're thinking about this like a game theoretic way? Well, the first thing we have to realize is cooperation is risky. Why is cooperation risky? Because it puts us in a circumstance where we're concerned with somebody, or we're doing things that benefit other people, and they might not return the favor, and that puts us in the worst circumstance. But we realize, or humans would realize, that the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. It's a war of all against all. That's not a circumstance we want. We want security, we want stability, and cooperation can lead to really great things. So we want to escape the state of nature, but cooperation is risky. So how can we make it less risky? What we need to escape the state of nature, or to escape the problem that the prisoner's dilemma saddled us with, we need rules that reward cooperation and punish betrayal. Because the worst circumstance is when other people are betraying us, when we're trying to cooperate, when we're pitching in and doing our fair share. So we want rules that reward cooperation, because remember, when both prisoners cooperate, that's what maximizes utility, only 2 years' time. And punish betrayal, because we don't want the worst situation where people are taking advantage and free riding, and the people pitching in aren't getting their fair share in return. So we need rules that reward cooperation and punish betrayal, and we need an enforcer powerful enough to enforce the rules. So the realization here is that not all of us can have the most wealth and power, and if we tried, we would end up in the state of nature where we're all scheming against each other, betraying each other. So what do we need to do? We need to compromise to avoid the likelihood of a brutal existence. We consent to be governed by the rules we set for ourselves. So this is where the power of social contract theory comes from. This is the strength of social contract theory. It starts from a place where we're all self-interested, or essentially self-interested, but because of the circumstances in which we live, the state of nature, or situations like the prisoner's dilemma, we consent to be governed by rules, and we set those rules for ourselves. So, well, especially if it's a democracy, right? If it's a monarchy, there are some complications there. But where does the legitimacy, the authority of the rules come from? It comes from ourselves. We want this, or we would want this, to escape a brutal existence. All right, so let's talk about the social contract then. What is a social contract? Let's talk about what a contract is. So a contract is an agreement which says that both parties involved consent to give up something in order to benefit. So that gets us back to our considerations on the last slide about this is beneficial for all. So an example, I agree not to kill or steal from you if you agree to do the same for me. We'd both benefit from the safety and peace of mind that that sort of arrangement would give us. How can we always trust each other? It's difficult. Even when there is a social contract in place, it's difficult. So what we do is we include another unbiased person, or one thing we might do is include another unbiased person, or as unbiased as we can find, to rule over us and enforce the contract. And this is the beginning of government. So if it's not the historical beginning, even if anthropology tells us that's not the historical beginning, this at least is the way to think about how we might justify being governed, or setting up a government to enforce the contract, because we don't want to get shortchanged, right? All right, so then back to contractarianism. What is morality by contract? So contractarianism holds that morally right actions are morally right just because they're permitted by the rules that free, equal, and rational people would agree to live by, on the condition, and this is important, on the condition that others obey these rules as well. So this holds for the laws. This also holds for this also is a source of moral obligation. What would we agree to if we were in a situation where we were of equal power and that we were free to deliberate and discuss what sort of rules we would want put in place, and we were rationally self-interested. What sort of rules would we come up with when we work together with others to develop those rules? All right, so this is the basic principle of contractarianism, but what sort of rules does that generate? What sort of rules would we follow if this is our principle for determining the rules of morality? So this is like the meta principle that determines the rules that we would live by. What sort of rules would we come up with this as our guiding principle? For that, we'll talk about, I'll introduce the philosophy of John Rawls in the next lecture. So thanks for sticking with me. Next time we'll talk about John Rawls and the content of social contract theory and the content of contractarianism. See you next time.